Miss Marple and the Christmas charity auction murder. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host Edward, and I'm so glad you're here. It's always a joy to share these quiet mysteries with you, no matter where in the world you're listening from. If you'd like, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I read every single one. Before we begin, just a quick reminder. Most of our listeners aren't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying these timeless stories and want more Miss Marple mysteries brought to life, subscribing is the best way to support Warm Pages. It's completely free, and it helps us keep the stories coming. Now, pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Death by the Hammer's Fall. The December wind whistled through the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding Thornfield Manor, carrying with it the first hints of winter's bite, and the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to evening service. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolen scarf more securely about her throat as she made her way up the gravel drive, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail of the imposing Georgian façade before her. The manor's windows blazed with warm yellow light, a welcoming sight on such a bitter afternoon, and the sound of animated conversation drifted from within. Such a worthy cause, she murmured to herself, clutching her small handbag more tightly. The annual Christmas charity auction at Thornfield Manor had become something of a tradition in recent years, drawing visitors from villages far and wide to bid on precious antiques, donated by the local gentry. All proceeds were destined for the village orphanage, a cause close to many hearts, particularly at this season of goodwill. The great hall of Thornfield Manor had been transformed for the occasion. Rows of gilded chairs faced a makeshift platform where Mr. Reginald Blackwood, the auctioneer, stood behind a mahogany lectern, his gavel poised with theatrical precision. He was a man of perhaps 55 years, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and an air of professional authority that commanded attention. His voice, cultured and resonant, carried easily through the assembled crowd as he described the merits of a delicate Sèvres porcelain tea service. Miss Marple found herself a seat in the third row, positioning herself where she might observe both the proceedings and the assembled company with equal facility. It was a habit of long standing, this quiet watching, and one that had served her well on numerous occasions. People she had learned revealed so much of themselves when they believed themselves unobserved. The crowd was an interesting mixture, she noted with satisfaction. There was Mrs. Hartwell from Meadowbrook House, her thin face set in lines of barely concealed bitterness, as she watched lot after lot pass before the auctioneer's hammer. Poor woman, Miss Marple reflected, recalling the unfortunate circumstances that had reduced the once proud family to such straitened conditions. The Hartwells had been obliged to sell most of their ancestral treasures, though rumour suggested that several pieces had been declined for today's auction, on grounds that were never quite made clear. Near the front sat Mr. Fletcher, the manor's estate manager, a nervous-looking man in his 40s whose hands seemed never quite still. He consulted his pocket watch repeatedly and cast anxious glances toward the platform where the more valuable lots waited their turn. Miss Marple had heard that the organization of the auction had fallen largely to him, a responsibility that appeared to weigh heavily upon his shoulders. The bidding for the porcelain tea service concluded at £43, won by a sharp-faced woman whom Miss Marple did not recognize. The successful bidder's smile was one of fierce satisfaction, and she made careful notes in a leather-bound notebook. Miss Sarah Mills, the auctioneer, announced, an antique dealer from London who had made the journey specifically for today's sale. Her eyes moved constantly over the remaining lots with the predatory gaze of one who made her living from such opportunities. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Blackwood's voice rose with practiced showmanship. We come to lot 27, a magnificent Victorian music box of exceptional quality and provenance. He gestured toward an ornate wooden box adorned with mother-of-pearl inlays and brass fittings. This remarkable piece dates from 1875 and plays no fewer than 8 different melodies. Shall we begin the bidding at £20? The response was immediate and spirited. Miss Mills raised her catalogue sharply, followed by a gentleman in the back row who Miss Marple recognized as Mr. Dmitri Volkov, Manna's recent purchaser. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the bearing of one accustomed to authority, and the slight accent that marked him as foreign-born. His acquisition of Thornfield Manor had caused considerable speculation in the village, though he had thus far proved a conscientious landlord and generous supporter of local causes. The bidding climbed steadily. £25, 30, 35. Mrs. Hartwell shifted restlessly in her seat, her gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap. Miss Marple observed with interest that the woman's attention seemed focused not on the music box itself, but on the towering grandfather clock that stood on the platform behind the auctioneer. It was a magnificent piece, easily 8 feet in height, its dark wood gleaming under the electric lights. The clock's deep tick seemed to punctuate the rapid-fire bidding like a solemn counterpoint to the excitement of the sale. £40, called Miss Mills, her voice sharp with determination. 45, counted Mr. Volkov, his tone measured and calm. Mr. Blackwood's gavel hovered over the lectern as he looked about the room for further bids. £45 I have. Will anyone say 50? The grandfather clock gave a particular loud tick at that moment, and Miss Marple found herself studying its position on the platform. It stood rather close to the auctioneer's lectern, she noticed, perhaps closer than was entirely prudent for such a massive piece. The supporting platform appeared sturdy enough, but there was something about the clock's stance that struck her as odd, though she could not immediately place what it might be. £50, Miss Mill's voice cut through her musings. The bidding continued with increasing intensity, the price rising past £60 as the two principal bidders faced each other with the determined air of combatants. Mr. Blackwood orchestrated the contest with evident pleasure, his silver head turning from one to the other as the amounts climbed higher. It was at the moment when the bidding reached £75 that disaster struck. Mr. Blackwood raised his gavel with a flourish, preparing to bring it down with his customary authority, when the great-grandfather clock behind him gave what sounded almost like a mechanical sigh. Miss Marple watched in fascination and growing horror as the massive timepiece tilted slowly forward, its 8 feet of solid wood and brass moving with the inexorable weight of destiny. The auctioneer turned at the sound, his face registering first confusion, then alarm, then stark terror as he realized what was happening. He took a single step backward, raising one hand as if to ward off the falling giant, but it was far too late. The clock struck him with tremendous force, driving him to the floor of the platform with a sound that Miss Marple would remember for the rest of her days. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Then, as if released from a spell, the assembled company erupted into cries of alarm and confusion. Several gentlemen rushed forward to assist, though it was immediately apparent that their help would be of no earthly use to Mr. Reginald Blackwood. Miss Marple remained in her seat, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. While others called for doctors and shouted instructions, she noticed several things that struck her as peculiar. The grandfather clock's fall, for instance, seemed to have been remarkably straight and controlled for such an apparently accidental toppling, and there was something about the position of the supporting brackets on the platform that appeared inconsistent with a simple case of inadequate securing. Most interesting of all, however, was the behavior of the assembled witnesses. Mr. Fletcher had gone quite pale and was fumbling with his pocket watch as if it were a lifeline. Miss Mills had closed her notebook with a sharp snap and was already making her way toward the exit. Mrs. Hartwell sat rigidly upright, her bitter expression unchanged, as though she had been expecting precisely such a catastrophe. And Mr. Volkov stood near the platform, his dark eyes fixed not on the fallen auctioneer but on the grandfather clock itself, his face bearing an expression of what might have been satisfaction. Dr. Hedok arrived within minutes, summoned by one of the servants, but his examination was brief and conclusive. Mr. Reginald Blackwood was quite dead, apparently crushed by the weight of the antique timepiece that now lay across his still form, like some grim monument to the fragility of human existence. A terrible accident, Inspector Slack pronounced when he arrived some 20 minutes later. These old clocks are devilishly heavy things. Should never have been positioned so close to where people were standing. Miss Marple said nothing, but her keen eyes continued their quiet observation. Accidents, in her long experience, were rarely as accidental as they first appeared, and there was something about this particular tragedy that reminded her most strongly of a similar incident many years ago in St. Mary Mead, when old Mr. Petherick's bookshelf had accidentally toppled over during a heated discussion about property boundaries. That had been no accident either, though it had taken considerable time and careful observation to prove otherwise. As the body was removed and the auction hastily cancelled, Miss Marple made her way quietly home through the December darkness, her mind already turning over the various inconsistencies she'd observed. The grandfather clock's perfectly controlled fall, the suspicious positioning of the brackets, and most particularly, the varied reactions of the witnesses, all suggested that this evening's tragedy was considerably more complex than Inspector Slack's hasty assessment would indicate. The wind had grown stronger during the evening, rattling the windows of her small cottage as she prepared her evening tea. But Miss Marple paid little attention to the weather. Her thoughts were entirely occupied with the events at Thornfield Manor, and the growing conviction that Mr. Reginald Blackwood had not died by accident at all, but had been murdered with considerable forethought and mechanical ingenuity. Tomorrow, she decided, would bring fresh opportunities for observation and inquiry. For if there was one thing that 60 years of village life had taught her, it was that truth, like cream, has a way of rising to the surface, given time and the proper conditions for its emergence. Chapter 2. The Crushed Skull Mystery. The morning following the tragedy at Thornfield Manor dawned grey and bitter, with frost painting delicate patterns on Miss Marple's cottage windows. She'd slept poorly, her mind returning again and again to the event she had witnessed, and she rose early to attend to her morning correspondence before the inevitable interruptions that such dramatic occurrences invariably brought to village life. She'd just finished her second cup of tea when her housekeeper, Mrs. Dollop, arrived with news that fairly bristled with importance. "Oh, Miss Marple," the good woman announced, setting down her marketing basket with unusual emphasis. "Such goings-on at the manor. They say Dr. Haydock has been there since dawn, examining that poor Mr. Blackwood's remains most particular-like, and Inspector Slack looking as thunderous as a summer storm he is." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "Indeed? How very thorough of Dr. Haydock. Though I confess I should have thought his examination yesterday evening would have been quite sufficient for such a straightforward accident." Mrs. Dollop's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of one who possessed information of considerable value. "Well, that's just it, isn't it? Word is it wasn't so straightforward after all. Mrs. Fletcher, that's the estate manager's wife, you know, she was helping with the clearing up, and she heard Dr. Haydock tell the inspector that something wasn't right about the whole business. This intelligence confirmed Miss Marple's own suspicions most satisfactorily. She encouraged Mrs. Dollop to share whatever additional details had reached her ears, which proved to be considerable. The village network of information, Miss Marple had long observed, rivaled the efficiency of the most sophisticated telegraph system. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had determined that a visit to Thornfield Manor would be both appropriate and potentially illuminating. Her ostensible purpose would be to offer condolences and assistance to Mr. Fletcher, who must surely be overwhelmed by the practical difficulties resulting from yesterday's catastrophe. Such visits were, after all, the natural response of any properly constituted member of the community. She found Inspector Slack in the great hall, examining the platform where yesterday's auction had met such a violent conclusion. The grandfather clock had been moved aside, revealing a considerable depression in the wooden flooring where Mr. Blackwood had fallen. The inspector's usual air of blustery confidence appeared somewhat subdued, and he greeted Miss Marple's arrival with the wary courtesy he typically reserved for situations that had grown unexpectedly complicated. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his hat brim with reluctant politeness, "I'm afraid this is rather a serious business now. Not quite the simple accident we first supposed." "How very distressing," Miss Marple replied, her tone conveying exactly the right degree of concern and curiosity. "I do hope there haven't been any additional complications." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that complications were precisely what had arisen. "Dr. Haydock's examination has revealed certain irregularities. It appears Mr. Blackwood sustained injuries that aren't entirely consistent with being struck by a falling clock." At that moment, Dr. Haydock himself emerged from side room, his medical bag in hand and his usually genial countenance grave with professional concern. He nodded to Miss Marple with familiar courtesy before addressing the inspector. "I've completed my preliminary examination," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of long medical experience. "The situation is rather more complex than we initially believed. While Mr. Blackwood certainly died as a result of the clock falling upon him, there's clear evidence that he had sustained a severe blow to the skull before the clock struck him." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose in an expression of innocent surprise. A blow to the skull? How very peculiar. Could such an injury have resulted from his falling when the clock began to topple? Dr. Haydock shook his head with professional certainty. "I'm afraid not. The wound is quite specific. A crushing blow delivered with considerable force by a heavy rounded object. The pattern of the injury suggests something like a bronze ornament or similar implement. Most definitely not the result of a fall or the clock's impact." Inspector Slack's jaw tightened with the grim realization that his simple accident had transformed into something far more sinister. "You're saying someone struck Mr. Blackwood before the clock fell?" "That appears to be precisely the case, Doctor," Haydock confirmed. "The head wound would have been fatal in itself, though death wasn't instantaneous. Someone then positioned the body beneath the clock and arranged for it to fall, presumably to disguise the true cause of death." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she typically devoted to particularly complex knitting patterns. The methodology suggested considerable planning and mechanical knowledge, qualities that limited the field of potential suspects considerably. "How fascinating," she murmured. "Rather like that unfortunate business with poor Mr. Cartwright in Little Wickham some years ago. He was found beneath a fallen garden wall, but it later emerged that he had been struck down first, and the wall toppled afterward to conceal the crime. Though in that case the motive proved to be far simpler than anyone had imagined." Inspector Slack regarded her with the suspicious attention he reserved for Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations. Experience had taught him that such comparisons often contained insights that his own investigative methods might overlook. "And what was the motive in that case?" he inquired, though his tone suggested he was not entirely certain he wished to know. "Blackmail," Miss Marple replied with quiet satisfaction. "Mr. Cartwright had discovered certain irregularities in the church accounts and was demanding payment for his silence. The treasurer, driven to desperation, struck him down with a bronze candlestick and then arranged the wall's collapse to suggest an accident." The parallel was certainly suggestive, and Inspector Slack made careful notes while Dr. Haydock packed away his instruments. The possibility that Mr. Blackwood had been engaged in some form of questionable activity that might have prompted murderous retaliation was one that clearly required investigation. As if summoned by their discussion, Mr. Fletcher appeared at the Great Hall's entrance, his face bearing the harried expression of one who had spent a sleepless night, grappling with unprecedented difficulties. His usual nervous energy seemed amplified by the morning's revelations, and his hands trembled slightly as he approached the small group. "Inspector Slack," he began, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled anxiety. "I've been going through Mr. Blackwood's papers as you requested, and I'm afraid I've discovered something rather disturbing." He produced a small bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, their external appearance suggesting official correspondence of some importance. These were locked in Mr. Blackwood's private case. They appeared to be, well, threats would be the most accurate description. Inspector Slack accepted the letters with a grim satisfaction of one whose suspicions had been confirmed. The topmost envelope bore Mr. Blackwood's name in a bold, anonymous hand, while the postmark indicated delivery only 3 days previously. "Have you read them?" the inspector inquired. Mr. Fletcher nodded reluctantly. "I'm afraid I felt it necessary given the circumstances. They're all signed 'The Collector,' and they accuse Mr. Blackwood of stealing items that rightfully belong to others. The language is quite specific and quite threatening." Miss Marple listened to this revelation with the careful attention of one who recognized the significance of seemingly minor details. The timing of the letters, arriving so shortly before Mr. Blackwood's death, suggested a connection that could hardly be coincidental. "How very disturbing," she observed. "Though I confess the signature 'The Collector' strikes me as rather theatrical. In my experience, truly dangerous individuals rarely announce themselves with such dramatic flourishes. Rather like that unpleasant business with the anonymous letters in Chipping Cleghorn. The real culprit proved to be someone who appeared entirely above suspicion." Inspector Slack opened the first letter and read its contents with growing interest. The accusations were indeed specific, claiming that Mr. Blackwood had acquired valuable antiques through questionable means and was now profiting from their sale through seemingly legitimate channels. "This suggests that yesterday's auction may not have been entirely what it appeared," Dr. Haydock observed. "If these allegations have any foundation, Mr. Blackwood may have been using the charity sale as a means of disposing of stolen goods. The implications of this possibility cast the previous evening's events in an entirely new light." Miss Marple found herself recalling her observations of the various participants' behavior, particularly their reactions to specific lots and their knowledge of the items being offered. It would certainly explain the rather intense bidding for certain pieces, she mused, and perhaps the curious fact that several donated items were apparently rejected for inclusion in the sale. I couldn't help but notice Mrs. Hartwell's expression when her family's contributions were mentioned. Mr. Fletcher's nervous disposition seemed to intensify this observation. Mrs. Hartwell was indeed rather bitter about that decision. Mr. Blackwood felt that her pieces didn't meet the auction standards, though I must say they appeared quite valuable to my untrained eye. The picture that was emerging suggested a web of deception considerably more complex than a simple charity auction. If Mr. Blackwood had indeed been involved in the trafficking of stolen antiques, the list of potential enemies would extend far beyond the immediate community. Inspector Slack folded the letters carefully and returned them to their ribbon binding. "I'll need to examine every item that was scheduled for yesterday's sale. If these accusations are accurate, we may be dealing with an international network of art theft." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very ambitious of Mr. Blackwood, if true, though I can't help but wonder about the murder weapon. Dr. Haydock mentioned a bronze implement of some kind." "That's correct," the doctor confirmed. "Something heavy and rounded capable of delivering a crushing blow. The wound pattern is quite distinctive." "And yet," Miss Marple continued with deceptive casualness, "I don't recall seeing any bronze ornaments among yesterday's auction lots that have since gone missing, which suggests either that the weapon was brought specifically for the purpose, or that it was removed from the scene afterward." This observation prompted a thorough search of the great hall and surrounding rooms, though no weapon matching Dr. Haydock's description was discovered. The absence of the murder weapon suggested a killer with sufficient presence of mind to dispose of the evidence, even in the immediate aftermath of such a dramatic crime. As the morning progressed and the investigation deepened, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Mr. Blackwood's death represented far more than a simple case of revenge. The elaborate nature of the crime, the careful arrangement of the grandfather clock, and the systematic removal of evidence all pointed to a calculating intelligence that had planned every detail with meticulous care. The question that remained was whether this intelligence belonged to one of yesterday's auction participants, or whether the true killer had yet to reveal themselves among the growing circle of suspects and witnesses. Chapter 3: Secrets in the Antique Collection. The afternoon brought with it a thin, watery sunshine that did little to dispel the chill that had settled over Thornfield Manor like a physical presence. Miss Marple had remained at the manor at Inspector Slack's grudging invitation, her quiet manner and unobtrusive questions proving unexpectedly useful. in the delicate business of examining the auction catalogue and its accompanying documentation. She sat now in the manor's morning room, the auction catalogue spread before her on a polished mahogany table, while winter light filtered through tall windows that overlooked the bare gardens. Each lot had been meticulously described, with accompanying photographs and certificates of authenticity that should have provided reassurance regarding the item's legitimate provenance. Yet the more closely Miss Marple examined these documents, the more certain irregularities began to emerge. "Most curious," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles to examine a particular certificate more closely. The paper bore all the appropriate seals and signatures, yet something about the typeface struck her as oddly modern for what purported to be documentation from the previous century. It reminded her rather forcibly of the forged testimonials that young Timothy Forsyth had produced when applying for a position at the post office, documents that had appeared quite convincing until one noticed that the letterhead paper showed watermarks that had only been introduced in recent years. Inspector Slack, who'd been conducting a systematic search of Mr. Blackwood's personal effects, approached the table with a leather portfolio that appeared to contain additional paperwork. His expression suggested discoveries of considerable significance. "These were hidden in a locked drawer of Blackwood's desk," he announced, opening the portfolio to reveal a collection of photographs and correspondence. "Rather interesting reading, I must say." The photographs proved to be professional studies of various antique pieces, each carefully documented with notes regarding dimensions, condition, and historical significance. What made them particularly intriguing, however, was that several items appeared in multiple photographs taken in different locations, suggesting that these valuable pieces had changed hands with unusual frequency. Miss Marple examined one photograph with particular attention. It showed a delicate Chinese vase of evident antiquity, photographed first in what appeared to be a private drawing room, then later against the neutral background of an auction house, and finally in what looked distinctly like the storage area of Thornfield Manor itself. "How very systematic," she observed. "Rather like Mrs. Weatherby's photograph album of her prize roses, documenting each bloom from bud to full flowering. Though in this case, I suspect we're looking at the progress of stolen goods from their original homes to their eventual sale." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "That's precisely what I'm beginning to suspect. Look at this correspondence." He produced a letter written on expensive stationery, its contents revealing a network of contacts across several European countries. The language was carefully neutral, referring to acquisitions and placement opportunities, in terms that might have described legitimate business transactions to a casual observer. However, the underlying meaning was considerably more sinister. At that moment, Mr. Volkoff appeared in the doorway, his distinguished bearing somewhat subdued by the gravity of recent events. He requested permission to speak with Inspector Slack on a matter of some importance, and was invited to join their examination of the evidence. "I feel I must be entirely frank about my reasons for purchasing Thornfield Manor," he began, his slight accent lending formality to his words. "My presence here was not entirely coincidental. I've been investigating Mr. Blackwood's activities for the better part of 2 years." This admission created a moment of profound silence. Miss Marple set down the photograph she'd been examining and regarded Mr. Volkoff with the careful attention she typically reserved for particularly complex revelations. "How very interesting," she said gently. "Might one inquire what prompted such an investigation?" Mr. Volkoff's expression grew distant, as though he were looking back across years of painful memory. "My family's estate in Eastern Europe was disrupted during the war. Many of our treasures were scattered, sold, or simply disappeared. I have spent considerable time and resources attempting to trace their whereabouts." He reached into his jacket and produced a small photograph, which he placed beside the auction catalogue. It showed a room of evident grandeur, its walls lined with paintings and display cases filled with precious objects. Several items were immediately recognizable from the auction materials spread across the table. "This photograph was taken in my family's home in 1938, Mr. Volkoff continued, Many of these pieces have appeared in various auction houses across Europe over the past decade, always with impeccable documentation regarding their provenance. Documentation which I now believe to have been entirely fabricated. Inspector Slack leaned forward with sharp interest. "You're saying that Blackwood was trafficking in stolen war loot?" "That is precisely what I am saying," Mr. Volkov confirmed. "My investigation led me to believe that he had established a sophisticated network for laundering stolen artworks, using legitimate auction houses and private sales to give these items apparently clean histories. The purchase of Thornfield Manor allowed me to observe his operations more closely." Miss Marple found this revelation deeply disturbing, though not entirely surprising given the evidence that had been accumulating. The theft and trafficking of cultural treasures represented a form of crime that struck at the very heart of civilized society, destroying not merely individual fortunes, but the collective heritage of entire nations. "How perfectly dreadful," she said quietly. "And you believe that yesterday's charity auction was part of this larger enterprise?" "I am convinced of it," Mr. Volkov replied. "Several of the items catalogued for sale were pieces that I recognize from my family's collection. The Christmas charity auction provided perfect cover. Who would suspect that such a worthy cause might be used to dispose of stolen goods?" The implications of this scheme were staggering in their cynical audacity. By using charity auctions to sell stolen treasures, Mr. Blackwood had not only profited from his crimes, but had done so under the guise of supporting worthy causes. The buyers, believing themselves to be contributing to charitable work, had unknowingly participated in an international trafficking network. Inspector Slack made careful notes while Mr. Volkov provided additional details about his investigation. The network appeared to extend across multiple countries, with stolen items moving through a carefully orchestrated series of sales and private transactions that gradually obscured their true origins. "This explains the threatening letters," Miss Marple observed. "If Mr. Blackwood had been systematically cheating his partners in this enterprise, keeping larger shares of the profits while they took the risks of actual theft, it would certainly provide motive for revenge." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Fletcher, who appeared even more agitated than he had that morning. He carried a ring of keys and wore the expression of one who had made discoveries of considerable unpleasantness. "Inspector," he began without preamble, "I've been conducting an inventory of the manor's storage areas as you requested, and I'm afraid I've found something quite disturbing." He led them through the manor's corridors to a heavy oak door that opened onto a stone staircase descending into the building's older foundations. The air grew noticeably cooler as they descended, and their footsteps echoed in the enclosed space with hollow resonance. The storage room that Mr. Fletcher revealed was far more extensive than its modest entrance had suggested. Stone walls lined with wooden shelving created a maze of compartments, each carefully organized and catalogued. The contents represented a treasure trove of historical artifacts that would have been the envy of any major museum. Miss Marple moved slowly through the aisles, her practiced eye cataloguing the extraordinary collection that surrounded them. Chinese porcelains of evident antiquity stood beside medieval religious artifacts. Renaissance paintings in gilded frames leaned against walls beside cases filled with ancient jewelry and precious metalwork. "Remarkable," she murmured. "Rather like Aladdin's cave, though I suspect considerably less legitimately acquired." Mr. Fletcher's nervous energy seemed amplified by their underground surroundings. "I had no idea," he insisted. "Mr. Blackwood told me these were items awaiting authentication before being offered for future sales. I thought I was simply maintaining a storage facility for legitimate antiques." The scope of the collection suggested an operation of truly international proportions. Items from across Europe and beyond had been systematically accumulated over what must have been many years of careful planning and execution. Inspector Slack examined the cataloging system with professional interest. Each item bore a discrete tag with numbers and letters that clearly corresponded to some form of organizational scheme. The methodical nature of the arrangement spoke to a mind that approached criminal enterprise with the same systematic attention that others might devote to legitimate business. This represents millions of pounds in stolen cultural artifacts, Mr. Volkov said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss. The restoration of these items to their rightful owners will require years of investigation and legal proceedings. Miss Marple paused before a particular display case, her attention caught by a bronze statuette that bore a resemblance to Dr. Haydock's description of the likely murder weapon. The piece was clearly ancient, its patinated surface bearing the unmistakable signs of great age and historical significance. "How very interesting," she observed, though she made no immediate comment about the statuette's potential significance. The investigation was revealing layers of complexity that extended far beyond a simple case of revenge, touching on issues of international law and the systematic plunder of cultural heritage. As they returned to the manor's upper floors, Miss Marple reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in her understanding of the previous evening's events. What had appeared to be a tragic accident at a village charity auction had revealed itself as the culmination of an international criminal enterprise of staggering proportions. The question that remained was whether Mr. Blackwood's killer had been motivated by personal revenge, professional rivalry, or the desire to prevent the exposure of crimes that extended far beyond the boundaries of their small village community. Chapter 4. The Auctioneer's Heavy Hand. The revelation of Mr. Blackwood's clandestine storage facility had cast a pall of unease over the already sombre atmosphere at Thornfield Manor. Miss Marple found herself in the estate's small library that evening, having accepted Mr. Fletcher's invitation to remain for dinner, while Inspector Slack continued his methodical examination of the mounting evidence. The room's warmth and familiar comfort of leather-bound volumes provided a welcome refuge from the day's disturbing discoveries. She had positioned herself near the fireplace with what appeared to be casual attention to a volume of Tennyson's poetry, though her actual focus remained entirely upon the conversation taking place between Inspector Slack and Mr. Fletcher at the far end of the room. Her long experience in such matters had taught her that the most revealing admissions often emerge during moments when speakers believe themselves to be speaking confidentially. The authentication certificates were always handled personally by Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Fletcher was explaining, his voice carrying the defensive tone of one who feared his own involvement might be questioned. He insisted that such delicate matters required his particular expertise. I was responsible only for the physical arrangements, cataloguing, storage, and preparation for auction. Inspector Slack's response was carefully neutral, though Miss Marple detected the underlying skepticism that characterized his more thorough investigations. "And you never questioned the frequency with which valuable pieces appeared in your inventories, or the rather remarkable consistency with which items of such quality became available for sale?" Mr. Fletcher's nervous energy manifested itself in the habitual consultation of his pocket watch, a gesture that Miss Marple had observed whenever he found himself under particular pressure. "One doesn't question good fortune, Inspector." Mr. Blackwood had cultivated relationships with collectors across Europe over many years. It seemed natural that he should have access to exceptional pieces. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who had completed his more detailed examination of the physical evidence and bore news of considerable significance. His expressions suggested discoveries that had confirmed his earlier suspicions regarding the nature of Mr. Blackwood's injuries. "The wound pattern is even more distinctive than I initially realized," he announced, accepting the chair that Mr. Fletcher hastily vacated. The implement used was not merely bronze, but specifically cast in a particular manner. The injury shows clear impressions of decorative elements, raised relief work that left quite specific markings. Miss Marple looked up from her volume with the expression of innocent interest that she had perfected over decades of similar investigations. "How fascinating! Rather like a signature, one might say." Dr. Haydock nodded with professional approval. "Precisely so. The weapon was almost certainly an ornamental statuette or similar decorative piece, probably depicting a human figure given the pattern of the impressions. Something with sufficient weight to deliver a fatal blow, yet small enough to be easily concealed and transported." This description immediately called to mind the bronze statuette that Miss Marple had observed in the storage facility, though she refrained from immediate comment. The timing of such revelations required careful consideration, particularly when dealing with Inspector Slack's somewhat volatile temperament regarding unsolicited observations. The question, Inspector Slack mused, is whether this weapon was brought specifically for the purpose of murder, or whether it was selected from items already present at the manor, or whether, Miss Marple added with deceptive casualness, it was chosen for its particular symbolic significance. In my experience, murderers often select their weapons with a sense of poetic justice that reveals a great deal about their motivations. She was reminded of the unfortunate affair of Colonel Bantry's nephew, who had met his end through poisoning by his own prized collection of rare mushrooms. The killer in that case had demonstrated a similar appreciation for dramatic irony, using the victim's own passion as the instrument of his destruction. Dr. Haydock's examination had also revealed additional details regarding the sequence of events. The head wound was delivered with considerable force, suggesting either great physical strength or intense emotional motivation. However, death would not have been instantaneous. Mr. Blackwood would have remained conscious for several minutes after the initial blow. This information cast the subsequent arrangement of the grandfather clock in an even more sinister light. The killer had not merely struck down his victim, but had then calmly proceeded to position the body and trigger the elaborate mechanism that would disguise the true nature of the crime. Most methodical, Miss Marple observed, though I confess I find myself wondering about the timing of the clock's fall. 7 minutes you mentioned yesterday, Inspector. Inspector Slack consulted his notes with the thoroughness that had begun to characterize his investigation. According to witness statements, approximately 7 minutes elapsed between the conclusion of the bidding and the clock's collapse. Several people remarked upon the delay, though at the time it seemed merely an unfortunate coincidence. 7 minutes, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Sufficient time for the killer to strike the blow, position the body, and trigger whatever mechanism caused the clock to fall. It suggests someone with intimate knowledge of both the manor's layout and the mechanical properties of that particular timepiece. Mr. Fletcher's expression grew increasingly troubled as the implications of this analysis became clear. The grandfather clock had been positioned on that platform for several days before the auction. Anyone with access to the manor could have examined its construction and stability. But how many people would have possessed the engineering knowledge necessary to create a delayed mechanism? Dr. Haydock inquired. Such a device would require both mechanical understanding and careful preparation. Miss Marple set aside her volume of poetry and rose to examine a framed photograph on the mantelpiece that showed Thornfield Manor during its Victorian heyday. The image revealed extensive grounds and outbuildings that spoke to the property's former status as a working estate. Mr. Fletcher, she said gently, I believe you mentioned yesterday that you had some experience in construction work before accepting your position here. The estate manager's face flushed with what appeared to be embarrassment rather than guilt. Indeed, Miss Marple, I trained as a carpenter and mason before the war. The practical skills proved useful when Mr. Volkoff required someone capable of maintaining a property of this complexity. Inspector Slack made careful note of this admission, though he refrained from immediate comment. The revelation that Mr. Fletcher possessed exactly the sort of mechanical knowledge that would be required to construct the clock's delayed mechanism placed him in a distinctly uncomfortable position regarding the investigation. Such skills must have been invaluable during the war, Miss Marple continued with apparently casual interest. I imagine you saw considerable service in the engineering corps. Royal Engineers, Mr. Fletcher confirmed, his nervous energy now manifesting itself in the unnecessary rearrangement of papers on the nearby desk. We were responsible for construction and demolition work throughout the European campaign. One learned to be quite resourceful with limited materials and time constraints. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a constable bearing additional correspondence that had been discovered among Mr. Blackwood's personal effects. These are quite recent, he announced. Communications with associates in London, Amsterdam, and Prague. The language is carefully coded, but the meaning is clear enough. Blackwood was planning to conclude his operations here and relocate to South America. Miss Marple received this intelligence with the careful attention she devoted to all significant revelations. How very convenient. Rather like Mrs. Henderson's sudden departure for Australia just before the irregularities in the church bazaar accounts came to light. Though in her case, the intended destination suggested a more permanent arrangement. The implications of Mr. Blackwood's planned departure were clear enough. The Christmas charity auction had been intended as his final operation, allowing him to dispose of the most valuable items in his collection before disappearing with the accumulated profits of years of systematic theft. Someone discovered his plans, Inspector Slack concluded grimly. Someone who couldn't afford to let him escape with evidence that might implicate them in his crimes. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Or someone whose personal losses were so profound that simple financial considerations paled beside the need for justice. Revenge, Inspector, is often a more powerful motivation than mere profit. As the evening deepened and the winter wind began to rattle the library's windows, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the complex web of relationships and motivations that had led to Mr. Blackwood's violent end. The investigation had revealed a criminal enterprise of international scope, touching lives across multiple countries and decades. The question that remained was which of these powerful motivations had finally overcome the normal constraints of civilized behavior, transforming someone from the ranks of respectable society into a calculating murderer capable of such elaborate and cold-blooded revenge. Chapter 5, Murder Most Brutal. The following morning brought with it a peculiar quality of light that seemed to leach color from the winter landscape, leaving Thornfield Manor standing like a monochrome photograph against the grey December sky. Miss Marple had risen early, her mind exercised by the various threads of evidence that had emerged during the previous day's investigations, and she found herself drawn once again to the great hall where the tragedy had unfolded. Standing alone in the vast space with only the faint tick of a distant clock to mark the passage of time, she contemplated the physical requirements that the murder would have demanded. Unlike the genteel poisonings that had characterized so many of the criminal cases in her experience, this death had required both considerable physical strength and a peculiar form of mechanical ingenuity that spoke to a mind both practical and vengeful. The positioning of Mr. Blackwood's body beneath the grandfather clock had been achieved with mathematical precision, suggesting someone entirely comfortable with matters of weight, balance, and structural engineering. More disturbing still was the emotional coldness required to complete such an elaborate charade while the victim lay dying from his initial injuries. Inspector Slack's arrival interrupted her contemplation, his expression bearing the focused intensity that had come to characterize his investigation as its true complexity became apparent. He carried with him a leather satchel containing what appeared to be additional correspondence and documentation. Miss Marple, he greeted her with the grudging respect that their previous collaborations had established. I wonder if you might spare a moment to consider some rather interesting discoveries that have emerged from our examination of Blackwood's business records. She accompanied him to the morning room where he spread across the mahogany table a collection of documents that revealed the systematic nature of Mr. Blackwood's criminal enterprise with startling clarity. Account books, correspondence, and photographic records painted a picture of operations that extended across multiple countries and involved dozens of co-conspirators. The scope is truly remarkable, Inspector Slack observed. Blackwood wasn't merely trafficking in stolen goods. He was orchestrating thefts to order, identifying specific pieces that would command high prices, and then arranging for their acquisition through his network of associates. Miss Marple examined a particular photograph with careful attention. It showed a country house in what appeared to be the process of being burgled, with figures visible in the background systematically removing valuable items. The professional quality of the documentation suggested that these criminal activities had been recorded for purposes of later authentication and sale. How very methodical, she murmured, rather like Mrs. Pemberton's systematic approach to her prize-winning garden competitions. Every detail planned and executed with military precision, though in this case, the harvest was considerably less innocent. The records revealed that several recent country house burglaries had been orchestrated by Blackwood's network, with items stolen to order based on specific requests from collectors who were willing to pay premium prices for pieces of particular historical significance. The charity auction system provided the perfect means of laundering these stolen treasures, giving them apparently legitimate provenance while generating substantial profits. The psychological aspect troubles me considerably, Miss Marple continued, studying a detailed plan of a country estate marked with notations regarding security arrangements and the location of valuable items. This represents a form of violation that extends beyond mere theft. It's the systematic destruction of family heritage and cultural memory. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. The financial losses alone represent millions of pounds. You're quite right about the deeper significance. Some of these stolen pieces are irreplaceable links to family history and national heritage. At that moment, Mr. Fletcher appeared at the doorway, his usual nervous energy amplified by what appeared to be considerable distress. He carried a small wooden box that he placed upon the table, with hands that trembled slightly. "Inspector," he began, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled emotion. "I've discovered something in the storage facility that I believe you should see immediately." The box contained a collection of military medals and decorations, their ribbons faded with age but their significance unmistakable. Each medal bore engraving that identified it as belonging to specific individuals who had served with distinction during the Great War. Miss Marple lifted one of the medals with the reverence due to such symbols of sacrifice and service. "These represent the very highest forms of human courage and dedication," she said quietly. "To steal such items is to commit a form of sacrilege that strikes at the heart of everything we hold sacred." Mr. Fletcher's distress became more apparent as he explained the circumstances of his discovery. These medals were stored separately from the other items, as though they held special significance. Several bear the names of men from this very district, men whose families still live in the surrounding villages. The implications were staggering in their callousness. Blackwood had not merely been stealing from wealthy collectors and distant museums, but had been systematically plundering the memorial treasures of local families, many of whom had already suffered the ultimate sacrifice of losing loved ones in service to their country. Among them, Mr. Fletcher continued with obvious difficulty, are the decorations awarded to my own father, who died at Passchendaele in 1917. I had wondered what became of his medals after my mother's death 5 years ago. This revelation cast Mr. Fletcher's involvement in an entirely new light. Rather than being a willing accomplice to Blackwood's crimes, he appeared to have been manipulated into facilitating the theft of his own family's most precious memorials. The psychological impact of such a discovery would be profound enough to drive even the most peaceful individual to desperate measures. Inspector Slack made careful notes while Miss Marple contemplated the symbolic significance of the murder weapon selection. If the bronze statuette had indeed been used to kill Blackwood, its choice represented more than mere convenience. It suggested a killer who wished to employ the very treasures that had been stolen as the instrument of justice. "The location where I found these medals is also significant," Mr. Fletcher continued. "They were stored in a section of the facility that I had never been permitted to access. Blackwood claimed it contained items too valuable to risk through normal handling procedures." Miss Marple found this detail particularly revealing. The systematic compartmentalization of the stolen goods suggested that Blackwood had been keenly aware of the psychological impact that certain thefts might have upon potential accomplices. By concealing the most emotionally significant items, he had been able to maintain the cooperation of individuals who might otherwise have refused to participate in his schemes. "The question that presents itself," she observed, "is whether Mr. Fletcher's recent discovery of his father's medals was coincidental, or whether someone deliberately arranged for him to find them at this particular moment." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that this possibility had not previously occurred to him. "You're suggesting that someone wanted Fletcher to learn the truth about his unwitting participation in these thefts?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied with gentle precision, "that the timing of revelations in criminal cases is rarely accidental. Someone with knowledge of these stolen medals' location chose to ensure that they would be discovered at precisely the moment when such a discovery would have maximum emotional impact." The afternoon brought additional revelations as the systematic examination of Blackwood's records continued. Evidence emerged of thefts from war memorials, veterans' organizations, and regimental museums across the country. The pattern suggested a criminal mind that had specifically targeted the most sacred symbols of military service and national sacrifice. The psychological profile that emerges is deeply disturbing. This represents not merely greed, but a form of systematic desecration that suggests profound contempt for the values and sacrifices that hold society together. The brutal nature of Blackwood's murder began to seem less shocking when viewed against the backdrop of his systematic violation of society's most sacred trusts. The killer had chosen to employ physical violence in a case where the victim's crimes had been characterized by a different but equally destructive form of brutality: the systematic theft of cultural memory and family heritage. As evening approached, and the investigation continued to reveal new layers of complexity, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the particular psychology required to plan and execute such an elaborate revenge. The killer had combined engineering knowledge with symbolic thinking, creating a death that served simultaneously as punishment and as a form of poetic justice that reflected the nature of the victim's crimes. The grandfather clock that had crushed Blackwood represented more than mere mechanical ingenuity. It embodied the weight of historical justice, the accumulated grievances of countless victims whose most precious possessions had been stolen and commodified by a man who'd shown no regard for their emotional significance or cultural importance. Chapter 6: The Missing Lot Number. A third morning of the investigation dawned with that peculiar clarity of light that sometimes follows the most tumultuous of winter storms, though the tempest in this case had been entirely human in its origins. Miss Marple sat in the morning room at Thornfield Manor, the auction catalogue spread before her once more, when she noticed a discrepancy that struck her as significant in the manner that seemingly trivial details often proved to be in cases of this nature. She adjusted her spectacles and examined the numbered sequence with a methodical attention. She'd once devoted to checking the parish accounts when irregularities had been suspected in the collection plate receipts. The pattern was most curious indeed. Lots numbered 46 and 48 were present and properly documented, yet lot 47 appeared to have vanished entirely from the records. "How very interesting," she murmured, making a careful note in the small notebook she always carried for such purposes. In her considerable experience, gaps in sequential numbering rarely occurred by accident, particularly in documents prepared by someone as meticulous as Mr. Blackwood had proven to be in his criminal enterprises. Inspector Slack arrived presently, bearing the slightly harried expression of one who had spent the better part of the night reviewing correspondence and attempting to trace the international connections that Blackwood's network had established. He accepted the cup of tea that Miss Marple had thoughtfully prepared, with the grateful manner of a man who had come to appreciate the small courtesies that made difficult investigations somewhat more bearable. "There's something rather puzzling about the auction catalogue," Miss Marple began, indicating the gap she had discovered. "Unless I'm very much mistaken, there appears to be a missing lot number. One might assume a simple error in preparation, but given what we've learned about Mr. Blackwood's systematic approach to these matters, I rather suspect the omission was deliberate." Inspector Slack examined the catalogue with renewed attention, his professional instincts immediately grasping the significance of her observation. "You're quite right. The sequence jumps from 46 to 48 with no explanation. If Blackwood was as methodical as the evidence suggests, he wouldn't have made such an elementary error." "Precisely so," Miss Marple agreed, "which raises the question of what lot 47 might have contained and why it was removed from the sale at the last moment. In my experience, when people go to the trouble of concealing something, it's generally because that something would prove rather embarrassing if revealed." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Fletcher, whose nervous disposition appeared to have been further exacerbated by a sleepless night. He carried with him a manila folder that he placed upon the table with obvious reluctance, as though the contents represented a burden he could no longer bear alone. "Inspector," he began, his voice carrying the weight of confession, "I must be entirely honest about lot 47. I was responsible for its removal from the auction, and I fear my actions may have had consequences I never intended." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision, recognizing the moment when long-suppressed truths finally demanded acknowledgement. Such moments, in her experience, required delicate handling if they were to yield their full significance. "Perhaps you might tell us what lot 47 contained," she suggested gently. I suspect it was something of particular personal importance. Mr. Fletcher opened the manila folder to reveal a collection of military decorations that were immediately recognizable as being of the same type that had been discovered in Blackwood's secret storage facility. However, these medals bore engravings that identified them as belonging to Lieutenant James Fletcher of the Gloucestershire Regiment, killed in action at Passchendaele on the 12th of October 1917. "These are my father's medals," Mr. Fletcher said quietly. "I discovered them among the items prepared for yesterday's auction. Only on the morning of the sale itself, Mr. Blackwood claimed they had been donated anonymously, and that their inclusion would add considerable prestige to the charitable cause." Inspector Slack examined the medals with professional interest, noting the particular decorations that had been awarded for exceptional valor under enemy fire. The Military Cross and Distinguished Conduct Medal represented the highest honors that could be awarded to an officer of Lieutenant Fletcher's rank, making their theft particularly reprehensible. "When did you first realize that these were your father's actual decorations?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "On the morning of the auction," Mr. Fletcher replied, his distress evident in every word. "I recognized them immediately. The engravings, the specific combination of awards, even a small dent in the military cross that had occurred during the action for which it was awarded. My mother had shown them to me countless times when I was a child." The implications of this discovery cast the events of that tragic evening in an entirely different light. Mr. Fletcher had been faced with the realization that his employer had not merely been trafficking in stolen goods, but had specifically targeted the most sacred memorials of his own family's sacrifice. "What did you do when you made this discovery?" Inspector Slack asked, though his tone suggested he had already formed certain suspicions regarding the answer. "I confronted Mr. Blackwood immediately," Mr. Fletcher admitted. "I demanded to know how he had acquired my father's medals and insisted that they be removed from the auction at once. The conversation became rather heated." Miss Marple could well imagine the nature of such confrontation. The discovery that one had been unknowingly facilitating the theft and sale of one's own father's military honors would be sufficient to drive even the most peaceable individual to extremes of emotion. "And Mr. Blackwood's response?" she prompted gently. Mr. Fletcher's hands trembled as he recalled the encounter. He was entirely without remorse. He claimed that the medals had been legitimately acquired from an estate sale, and that their sentimental value to my family was irrelevant to their commercial worth. He suggested that if I found the situation distressing, I was free to seek employment elsewhere. The callousness of such a response revealed much about Blackwood's character, and the contempt he held for the emotional significance of the items he trafficked. To dismiss a son's anguish over his father's stolen decorations as mere sentimentality demonstrated a form of moral blindness that made his subsequent fate seem almost inevitable. "The argument took place in the storage facility," Mr. Fletcher continued. "Mr. Blackwood was examining items for the final time before the auction began. He had in his hands a bronze statuette, a figure of a Roman soldier that had been donated some weeks earlier. During our confrontation, he struck the table with it repeatedly, emphasizing his points with considerable violence." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. The bronze statuette that Mr. Fletcher described matched perfectly with Dr. Haydock's assessment of the likely murder weapon, and its presence in Blackwood's hands during their heated argument provided a clear connection between the morning's confrontation and the evening's tragedy. "What happened then?" Inspector Slack asked, his professional interest now sharply focused. "I left him there among his stolen treasures," Mr. Fletcher replied bitterly. "I removed my father's medals from the auction lots and locked them in my own office safe. But the damage to my peace of mind was irreparable. For years I had been facilitating the very crimes that had robbed my family of our most precious possessions. The psychological impact of such a realization could hardly be overstated. Mr. Fletcher had discovered that his unwitting cooperation had made him complicit in desecrating his father's memory, a discovery that would weigh heavily upon any man's conscience." "The bronze statuette," Miss Marple observed carefully. "Did Mr. Blackwood retain it after your argument?" He was still holding it when I left, Mr. Fletcher confirmed. He seemed quite attached to it, actually. He claimed it was a particularly fine example of Roman military art, worth considerably more than most people would realize. The irony was bitter indeed, that Blackwood should meet his end through the agency of a statuette depicting a Roman soldier, struck down while surrounded by the very military decorations he'd stolen from the families of Britain's own fallen warriors. The symbolic appropriateness of such justice was almost too perfect to be entirely coincidental. As the morning progressed and additional details emerged, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the terrible weight of discovery that had fallen upon Mr. Fletcher's shoulders. To learn that one's trusted employer had systematically robbed one's own family, while maintaining a facade of respectability, would be sufficient to shatter even the strongest character. The question that remained was whether knowledge of his father's stolen medals had merely provided motive for murder, or whether the psychological shock had been sufficient to transform a decent man into a calculating killer, capable of the mechanical ingenuity that Blackwood's death had required. Chapter 7. A Bid for Revenge. The afternoon of the third day brought with it a most unexpected development in the form of Mrs. Hartwell's unannounced arrival at Thornfield Manor. Miss Marple, who had been examining the manor's extensive library for any additional insights into its recent history, observed through the tall windows as the widow's familiar black motor car proceeded up the gravel drive with the determined purpose of one who had reached certain irrevocable decisions. Mrs. Hartwell's appearance had always suggested a woman acquainted with grief, but today her austere bearing seemed to have acquired an additional quality of grim resolution. She was admitted to the morning room where Inspector Slack had established his temporary headquarters, her manner indicating that she bore information of considerable significance. "Inspector," she began without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority of one accustomed to managing substantial domestic establishments. "I believe it is time I spoke truthfully about my dealings with the late Mr. Blackwood. My silence has been motivated by considerations that I now realize were both selfish and potentially obstructive to justice." Miss Marple positioned herself with the unobtrusive skill of long practice, where she might observe both the speaker and Inspector Slack's reactions. Experience had taught her that such moments of voluntary confession often revealed truths that no amount of official questioning could extract. "Please proceed, Mrs. Hartwell," Inspector Slack replied, his tone carefully neutral, though his attention was clearly engaged. "Any information you might provide would be most helpful to our investigation." Mrs. Hartwell arranged herself in the chair with the precise movements of one who had spent a lifetime maintaining rigid self-control. "5 years ago, following my husband's death, I found myself in considerably reduced circumstances. The estate duties and various debts required that I dispose of most of our family's collection of antiques and artworks." She paused, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed the emotional cost of such admissions. "Mr. Blackwood approached me with an offer to handle the sale of these items through his network of collectors and auction houses. He claimed he could achieve considerably higher prices than would be possible through conventional channels." Inspector Slack made careful notes while Mrs. Hartwell continued her account. The arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. Mr. Blackwood would receive a commission for his services, while I would obtain the funds necessary to maintain my independence. I trusted him completely, believing him to be a man of impeccable professional reputation. "And the outcome?" Miss Marple inquired gently, though she suspected she already knew the essential facts. Mrs. Hartwell's expression hardened with barely suppressed anger. "I received payments that represented only a fraction of the item's true value. When I attempted to inquire about the discrepancy, Mr. Blackwood provided explanations that seemed plausible, but which I gradually began to suspect were entirely fabricated. The pattern was becoming depressingly familiar, another victim of Blackwood's systematic exploitation of individuals in vulnerable circumstances." Miss Marple reflected upon the particular cruelty of targeting those who had already suffered significant losses, compounding their grief with financial betrayal. "I began to make inquiries through other channels," Mrs. Hartwell continued, What I discovered was deeply disturbing. Several of my family's most valuable pieces had appeared in international auction houses, with documentation that attributed them to entirely different sources. My Waterford crystal collection, for instance, was sold in Geneva as having belonged to a French chateau, while my grandmother's jewellery appeared in a London auction described as the property of a lady. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with sharp interest. "You're saying that Blackwood was deliberately misrepresenting the provenance of your items?" "I'm saying that he was engaged in systematic fraud," Mrs. Hartwell replied with bitter precision. "He would purchase items from desperate sellers at below-market prices, then create false documentation that would allow him to sell them at their full value, while keeping the substantial difference for himself." Miss Marple found this revelation particularly illuminating, as it suggested that Blackwood's criminal activities extended beyond the trafficking of obviously stolen goods to include the exploitation of legitimate sellers through fraudulent documentation. "Did you confront Mr. Blackwood with these discoveries?" Inspector Slack asked. Mrs. Hartwell's composure wavered slightly. "I attempted to do so on several occasions. His responses were dismissive. He suggested that I had misunderstood the complexities of the international art market, and that my concerns were based on incomplete information." "Most unsatisfactory," Miss Marple observed, rather like Mr. Weatherby's response when questioned about the discrepancies in the church roof fund. Elaborate explanations that obscured rather than clarified the essential facts. "Exactly so," Mrs. Hartwell agreed. "But I was not content to accept such evasions. I began to document everything: correspondence, receipts, photographs of items before they were sold, and records of the prices they subsequently achieved in various markets." She produced from her handbag a leather portfolio that contained what appeared to be extensive documentation. "I intended to expose his practices through legal channels, but I needed sufficient evidence to prove systematic fraud rather than mere incompetence." Inspector Slack examined the contents of the portfolio with growing amazement. Mrs. Hartwell had compiled a comprehensive record of Blackwood's fraudulent activities, complete with photographs, correspondence, and detailed financial analyses that demonstrated the systematic nature of his deceptions. "This represents months of careful investigation," he observed admiringly. "You've assembled evidence that would support criminal charges across multiple jurisdictions." "I'd hoped to present this evidence before yesterday's auction," Mrs. Hartwell admitted. "My intention was to expose his practices publicly and prevent other families from suffering the same losses I had endured." Miss Marple studied the documentation with the methodical attention she had once devoted to organizing the parish records. The thoroughness of Mrs. Hartwell's investigation suggested a woman of considerable determination and intelligence, qualities that would make her a formidable opponent for someone engaged in criminal activities. "The timing of your planned exposure is most interesting," she observed. "Mr. Blackwood would have been aware that his activities were under scrutiny. Such knowledge might have prompted him to accelerate his plans for departure. Or," Inspector Slack added grimly, "it might have made him desperate enough to take extreme measures to silence his accusers." Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew troubled. "I did receive several anonymous letters warning me to abandon my investigations. The language was threatening. I assume they came from Mr. Blackwood himself, though I could never prove it." This information added another layer of complexity to the investigation. If Blackwood had been aware that his activities were under systematic investigation, he might have been driven to increasingly desperate measures to protect his criminal enterprise. The threatening letters suggested a man who would not hesitate to use intimidation to maintain his position. At that moment, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Sarah Mills, the London antique dealer who had been such an aggressive bidder at the ill-fated auction. Her appearance was somewhat different from the sharp-eyed professional who had been present 2 days earlier. Today she carried herself with the authority of one who possessed official credentials. "Inspector Slack," she announced, producing a wallet containing identification documents. "I believe it's time I revealed my true purpose in attending Monday's auction. My name is Sarah Mills, and I am an investigator with Lloyd's of London specializing in art theft and insurance fraud." Miss Marple regarded this development with the satisfaction of one who had suspected that the various participants in Monday's auction had not all been present for the reasons they had claimed. The revelation that a professional investigator had been among the bidders suggested that Blackwood's activities had attracted official attention from sources he had not anticipated. "I've been tracking Blackwood's network for the better part of 2 years," Miss Mills continued. "Monday's auction represented the culmination of a long investigation into systematic art theft and fraud across multiple European countries. The convergence of so many different investigations, Mrs. Hartwell's personal quest for justice, Mr. Volkoff's search for his family's stolen treasures, and now Miss Mills' official inquiry, suggested that Blackwood's criminal enterprise had been approaching a crisis point that would have made his planned departure to South America not merely convenient, but absolutely necessary for his survival. The question that presents itself," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, "is whether someone among this gathering of investigators and victims decided that official justice would be insufficient to address the magnitude of Mr. Blackwood's crimes." As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the full scope of the conspiracy against Blackwood became apparent, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the terrible arithmetic of revenge. Multiple individuals had suffered profound losses at his hands, each with compelling reasons to wish him harm. Chapter 8. The Storage Room Discovery. The fourth morning of the inquiry brought with it an atmosphere of mounting tension that seemed to permeate the very stones of the Thornfield Manor. Miss Marple had passed a restless night, her mind occupied with the various threads of evidence that had emerged, each one pointing toward a conclusion that remained tantalizingly beyond her grasp. She had risen early and made her way to the Manor's breakfast room, where she found Inspector Slack already deep in consultation with his sergeant over a detailed map of the estate's outbuildings. "Ah, Miss Marple," the inspector greeted her with the grudging cordiality that had developed between them. "We were just discussing the necessity of conducting a more thorough search of the Manor's storage facilities. Yesterday's revelations have convinced me that we may have overlooked areas of considerable significance." Miss Marple accepted the cup of tea that the thoughtful sergeant provided, and settled herself where she might observe the proceedings, with her customary attention to detail. "A most sensible precaution, Inspector. In my experience, the most revealing evidence often lies in the places that appear least likely to yield significant discoveries." She was reminded of the unfortunate affair of the missing church silver, which had eventually been discovered in the bell tower of all places, concealed by someone who had calculated that such an obvious hiding place would be the last location anyone would think to examine thoroughly. Inspector Slack spread the estate map across the breakfast table, indicating several areas that had not yet received detailed attention. The Manor's foundations include a network of cellars and storage chambers that date back several centuries. Fletcher has provided us with keys to the areas he was aware of, but there may be additional spaces that were known only to Blackwood himself. The prospect of exploring the Manor's hidden recesses held considerable appeal for Miss Marple, whose long experience in village mysteries had taught her that the most significant secrets were invariably concealed in the most unexpected locations. She expressed her willingness to participate in the search, a suggestion that Inspector Slack accepted with the pragmatic recognition that her observational skills had proven invaluable to the investigation. The exploration began in the basement areas adjacent to the storage facility, where Blackwood's collection had been discovered. The stone corridors extended further than the original architectural plans had suggested, indicating modifications and expansions that had been made over the centuries without being properly documented. It was Miss Marple who first noticed the discrepancy in the corridor's proportions that suggested the presence of a concealed chamber. The spacing between the doorways appeared inconsistent with the rooms they accessed, creating a gap that could only be explained by the existence of an additional space. Most curious, she observed, examining the stone wall with the methodical attention she had once devoted to identifying the source of mysterious drafts in the parish vestry. Unless architectural principles have changed considerably since this manor was constructed, there should be a room of substantial size behind this wall. Inspector Slack's examination revealed what appeared to be the outline of a doorway that had been carefully sealed with stones that matched the surrounding wall. The craftsmanship was sufficiently skilled that the concealment would have escaped casual observation, but close inspection revealed the telltale signs of relatively recent construction. The process of opening the sealed chamber required considerable effort and the services of a local mason, but the results more than justified the expenditure of time and energy. The hidden room proved to contain a collection of artifacts that dwarfed even the impressive accumulation they had discovered in Blackwood's primary storage facility. The chamber was considerably larger than its concealed entrance had suggested, extending deep into the manor's foundations with the walls lined by custom-built shelving and display cases. The contents represented what could only be described as a private museum of stolen cultural treasures, each piece carefully catalogued and preserved, with the attention to detail that one might expect from a legitimate institution. Miss Marple moved through the collection with growing amazement at its scope and quality. Renaissance paintings by masters whose names were familiar to even the most casual student of art history shared space with medieval manuscripts, ancient Greek statuary, and Egyptian artifacts of museum quality. The accumulated value of the collection would undoubtedly run into millions of pounds. "Remarkable," she murmured, pausing before a display case containing what appeared to be a collection of Roman military artifacts. "This represents decades of systematic acquisition through the most sophisticated criminal network I have ever encountered." Inspector Slack's attention was drawn to a particular section of the chamber, where items appeared to have been recently handled. Fresh dust patterns on the shelving indicated that several pieces had been removed and replaced within the past few days, suggesting that Blackwood had been making final selections for Monday's auction. Among the recently disturbed items was an empty pedestal that bore a small placard identifying it as the display location for a bronze statuette of a Roman centurion, dated to the 2nd century and acquired from a private collection in northern Italy. The absence of the piece from its designated location was particularly significant, given Dr. Haydock's description of the likely murder weapon. "The Roman soldier," Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction. "I believe we may have found the original location of the weapon that ended Mr. Blackwood's life." The discovery provided the final link in the chain of evidence that connected the murder weapon to Blackwood's collection of stolen artifacts. The bronze centurion had not been brought to the manor specifically for the purpose of murder, but had been selected from among the stolen treasures that surrounded its owner at the moment of his death. Inspector Slack examined the pedestal and its identifying placard with professional interest. According to these records, the statuette was stolen from the Villa Adriana outside Rome 3 years ago. It's described as one of the finest examples of Roman military art in private hands. The symbolic appropriateness of the weapon selection was almost too perfect to be entirely coincidental. That Blackwood should meet his end through the agency of a Roman centurion, surrounded by the accumulated plunder of his criminal career, suggested a killer with a highly developed sense of poetic justice. Further exploration of the chamber revealed evidence of the systematic documentation that had characterized all of Blackwood's activities. Detailed records showed the provenance of each item, the circumstances of its acquisition, and its eventual disposition through various sales channels. The files read like a catalogue of cultural destruction, documenting the systematic plunder of museums, private collections, and archaeological sites across Europe and beyond. Miss Marple paused before a particular file that contained photographs of items in their original locations, taken apparently for the purpose of planning their theft. The images showed country houses, churches, and museums, each marked with notations regarding security arrangements and the location of specific targets. "The methodical nature of these operations is truly chilling," she observed. "This represents not merely opportunistic theft, but systematic cultural vandalism conducted with the precision of a military campaign." The investigation of the hidden chamber continued well into the afternoon, with each new discovery adding additional layers to their understanding of Blackwood's criminal enterprise. The scope of the operation extended far beyond anything they had initially imagined, involving dozens of collaborators across multiple countries and representing losses that would take years to properly assess. As evening approached and the examination of the chamber neared completion, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the profound psychological impact that such a discovery would have had upon someone who had unknowingly facilitated these crimes. To learn that one had been manipulated into supporting such systematic cultural destruction would be sufficient to shatter even the strongest moral constitution. The bronze centurion that had served as Blackwood's executioner had been returned to its pedestal, she noticed, though there were traces of recent cleaning that suggested efforts had been made to remove evidence of its recent employment. The killer had possessed sufficient presence of mind to restore the weapon to its proper location, a detail that spoke to careful planning and considerable familiarity with the chamber's contents and organization. The discovery of this hidden museum of stolen treasures provided the final piece of evidence necessary to understand the full magnitude of Blackwood's crimes and the profound impact they would have had upon anyone who discovered the true nature of their unwitting participation in such systematic cultural destruction. Chapter 9. Truth in the Final Strike. The evening of the fourth day brought with it a peculiar quality of expectancy that seemed to hang over Thornfield Manor like morning mist before the sun burnt it away. Miss Marple had observed this phenomenon on numerous occasions when investigations approached their natural conclusion. A subtle alteration in the very atmosphere that suggested truths long concealed were finally pressing toward revelation. She had positioned herself in the manor's drawing room, ostensibly occupied with a volume of botanical illustrations that she had discovered among the estate's surprisingly comprehensive library. In reality, her attention was entirely focused upon the conversation taking place between Inspector Slack and Mr. Fletcher in the adjacent morning room, their voices carrying clearly through the partially opened connecting door. The inspector's questioning had taken on the methodical precision of one who had assembled sufficient evidence to proceed with confidence, though he maintained the careful courtesy that characterized his more successful interrogations. Mr. Fletcher's responses had grown increasingly strained as the afternoon progressed, his usual nervous energy manifesting itself in the constant consultation of his pocket watch and the restless rearrangement of papers upon the desk. The discovery of the hidden chamber has provided considerable clarity regarding the scope of Mr. Blackwood's operations, Inspector Slack was saying, his tone deliberately neutral. What troubles me, however, is the question of how someone gained access to that facility on the evening of the auction. Miss Marple could hear the slight tremor in Mr. Fletcher's voice as he replied, "As estate manager, I naturally possessed keys to all areas of the manor. Mr. Blackwood insisted upon it for purposes of maintenance and security." Indeed, the inspector continued with the relentless patience of one who sensed that significant admissions were approaching. "And the bronze centurion that we discovered on its pedestal, you were, of course, familiar with its location and significance." The silence that followed this question was sufficiently prolonged that Miss Marple felt compelled to glance toward the morning room. Though she maintained her apparent absorption in the botanical illustrations, experience had taught her that such moments of hesitation often preceded the most crucial revelations. "I had seen it on numerous occasions," Mr. Fletcher finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Blackwood was particularly proud of that piece. He claimed it was one of the finest examples of Roman military art in existence. Inspector Slack's next words carried the weight of inexorable logic. The irony is rather remarkable, isn't it? That a man who had spent years stealing military artifacts should meet his end through the agency of a Roman centurion, surrounded by the very treasures he had accumulated through systematic theft. Miss Marple heard the sound of a chair being pushed back from the desk, followed by footsteps that suggested considerable agitation. Mr. Fletcher's voice, when it came, carried a note of barely controlled emotion that indicated the careful restraint of days was finally beginning to crumble. "You don't understand," he said, his words tumbling over one another with the urgency of long-suppressed confession. "I never intended for anyone to be harmed. My only wish was to expose his crimes and ensure that the stolen items were returned to their rightful owners. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, its implications immediately apparent to all present. Miss Marple set aside her volume and moved quietly to where she might observe the proceedings directly, recognizing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Inspector Slack's response was measured and professional. "Perhaps you might tell us exactly what transpired on Monday evening, Mr. Fletcher. I believe the time for partial explanations has passed." Mr. Fletcher sank into his chair with the deflated appearance of one from whom a tremendous burden was finally being lifted. "After our argument that morning regarding my father's medals, I spent the day in a state of considerable distress. The realization that I had been unknowingly facilitating the theft of my own family's most sacred possessions was overwhelming." Miss Marple listened with the careful attention she'd always devoted to moments of human crisis, recognizing in Mr. Fletcher's voice the particular quality of anguish that accompanies the complete collapse of one's understanding of the world and one's place within it. As the auction progressed that evening, he continued, "I found myself unable to concentrate on my duties. The sight of Mr. Blackwood conducting his performance with such evident satisfaction, knowing what I now knew about the true nature of his enterprise, became increasingly unbearable." Inspector Slack made careful notes while maintaining the sympathetic silence that encouraged further revelation. "What decided you upon action?" "It was when he reached for his gavel to conclude the bidding on the Victorian music box," Mr. Fletcher replied, his voice growing stronger as the confession progressed. "I realized that within minutes he would have completed another successful sale of stolen goods, adding to his accumulated profits, while the true owners remained ignorant of their losses." The sequence of events that he described matched precisely with Miss Marple's own observations of that tragic evening. The delay between the conclusion of bidding and the clock's fall, the mechanical precision with which the timepiece had toppled, and the symbolic appropriateness of the weapon selection all reflected a mind that had planned its actions with considerable care. I had discovered, through my examination of the hidden chamber, that the grandfather clock could be made to fall through the manipulation of certain supporting mechanisms. Mr. Fletcher explained with the technical precision of his engineering background. The delay could be precisely calculated by adjusting the tension of specific cables. Miss Marple found herself impressed despite the circumstances by the ingenuity of the mechanism he described. It reminded her rather forcibly of the elaborate mousetraps that young Tommy Beresford had constructed during his mechanical phase, devices that achieved their purposes through chains of precisely timed actions. But the clock was intended merely to create confusion and provide opportunity for escape, Mr. Fletcher continued. My actual purpose was to confront Mr. Blackwood privately and demand that he cease his criminal activities immediately. Inspector Slack's expression suggested considerable skepticism regarding this version of events. And yet Dr. Caddick's examination confirmed that Mr. Blackwood died from the blow to his skull, not from the clock's impact. A final barrier to complete confession seemed to crumble at this observation. Mr. Fletcher's composure dissolved entirely as he described the confrontation that had taken place in the hidden chamber during the early stages of the auction. I had waited until the bidding was well underway before making my way to the storage facility, he admitted. Mr. Blackwood was there, making final preparations for items that were to be offered in future sales. He had the bronze centurion in his hands, examining it with evident satisfaction. The scene that he described possessed the terrible inevitability of classical tragedy. Two men, each driven by powerful emotions, meeting in a chamber filled with the evidence of systematic cultural destruction, with the instrument of justice literally at hand. When I confronted him with my knowledge of his crimes, particularly the theft of war memorials and veterans' decorations, his response was one of complete indifference. Mr. Fletcher continued, his voice now steady with the calm that often follows the complete unburdening of conscience. He suggested that my sentimental attachment to such items merely demonstrated my failure to appreciate their true commercial value. Miss Marple could well imagine the effect that such callous dismissal would have had upon a man who had already been profoundly shocked by the discovery of his unwitting complicity in his father's desecration. The combination of personal anguish and moral outrage would have been sufficient to overcome even the strongest inhibitions against violence. The bronze centurion was in his hands, Mr. Fletcher said quietly. He was using it to emphasize his points, striking the table repeatedly as he explained why my concerns were irrelevant to his business arrangements. In that moment, surrounded by all those stolen treasures, listening to his contemptuous dismissal of everything I held sacred, something inside me simply broke. The confession that followed was both terrible and oddly dignified in its complete honesty. Mr. Fletcher described how the confrontation had escalated, how the bronze centurion had been employed with fatal effect, and how the elaborate mechanism of the grandfather clock had been triggered to create the appearance of accidental death. I returned the centurion to his pedestal, he concluded, and made my way back to the auction room to await the clock's fall. I told myself that justice had been served, that a man who had shown such contempt for the sacrifices of others had met an appropriate end. Inspector Slack completed his notes with the methodical attention to detail that characterized his more serious investigations. Mr. Fletcher, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence against you. You're under arrest for the murder of Mr. Reginald Blackwood. As the formal procedures of arrest were concluded, Miss Marple reflected upon the terrible arithmetic of justice that had led to this moment. A decent man, driven to desperation by the discovery of his unwitting participation in crimes that violated everything he held sacred, had taken the law into his own hands with consequences that would destroy his life as surely as they had ended his victims. The bronze centurion, she thought, had indeed served as an instrument of justice, though not in the manner its Roman creators had ever intended. Chapter 10. Justice Hammered Home. The winter sun that rose over Thornfield Manor on the morning following Mr. Fletcher's arrest possessed a quality of clarity that seemed to illuminate more than merely the frost-covered grounds and bare oak trees. Miss Marple, standing at the morning-room window with her customary cup of tea, reflected upon the manner in which truth, once revealed, cast everything that had preceded it in an entirely different light. Inspector Slack had departed during the early hours, accompanying his prisoner to the county jail, where the formal processes of justice would begin their inexorable progression. The manor itself seemed to exhale a profound sense of relief, as though the building itself had been holding its breath throughout the days of investigation, and could finally resume its natural rhythms. The task of cataloguing and returning the stolen artifacts had fallen to Miss Mills, whose expertise in such matters would prove invaluable in the complex process of restoration. She had arrived at dawn with a team of specialists, their motor cars laden with the equipment necessary to document and transport cultural treasures with appropriate care. The scope of restitution will require months, perhaps years, she explained to Miss Marple, as they observed the careful removal of items from Blackwood's hidden chamber. Many of these pieces have been missing for decades, and their original owners may prove difficult to trace. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, watching as a Renaissance painting was secured in protective wrapping for its journey back to legitimate custody. Rather like the restoration of the parish church windows after the great storm of '28, she observed. Such work cannot be hurried if it is to be done properly. Mr. Volkoff had arrived shortly after breakfast, his dignified bearing somewhat lightened by the prospect of recovering several pieces from his family's collection. He moved through the hidden chamber with the careful reverence of one who was reclaiming not merely objects of value, but fragments of memory and identity that had been torn from their proper context. This collection represents more than monetary loss, he explained as he examined a Byzantine icon that had once graced his family's private chapel. These are the physical connections to our history, our culture, our very sense of who we are as a people. Miss Marple understood completely. She had observed similar emotions during the return of family heirlooms that had been thought lost forever. The profound relief and joy that accompanied the restoration of tangible links to one's heritage. Such moments reminded her why crimes against cultural property struck so deeply at the human heart. Mrs. Hartwell had also arrived to witness the proceedings, her austere bearing softened by what appeared to be a measure of satisfaction at the exposure of Blackwood's fraudulent practices. Several pieces from her family's collection were identified among the recovered items, though she declined to reclaim them immediately. Let them be properly catalogued and documented first, she insisted with characteristic precision. After years of deception and false provenance, these items deserve to be handled with complete transparency. The afternoon brought news that Blackwood's international network was being systematically dismantled by authorities across Europe. The documentation discovered at Thornfield Manor had provided investigators with a comprehensive map of criminal activities spanning multiple countries and involving dozens of accomplices. The full extent of the losses may never be completely calculated, Miss Mills reported, as she supervised the careful packing of ancient Greek pottery. But the recovery of this collection represents one of the most significant victories against organized art theft in recent memory. Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious mathematics of justice that had brought these events to their conclusion. Mr. Fletcher's desperate act had inadvertently exposed crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, allowing countless additional victims to suffer losses they would never have understood. The moral complexities of the situation were considerable. While no civilized society could condone the taking of life, even in circumstances of profound provocation, it was impossible to ignore the fact that Fletcher's actions had ultimately served the cause of justice for hundreds of victims across multiple countries. There will be mitigating circumstances to consider at his trial, Inspector Slack had observed before his departure. The discovery of his father's stolen medals, the psychological impact of learning about his unwitting complicity, and the systematic nature of Blackwood's crimes will all weigh heavily with any jury. As evening approached and the day's work of cataloguing and removal neared completion, Miss Marple made her way to the Manor's small chapel, a modest stone building that had served the spiritual needs of Thornfield's inhabitants for several centuries. The space possessed the particular quality of peace that she had always associated with places dedicated to quiet contemplation. She was not surprised to find that she was not alone in seeking such solitude. Mr. Volkoff knelt before the altar, his hands clasped in what appeared to be prayer, though whether of gratitude, supplication, or mourning she could not determine. The recovery of his family's treasures had clearly been accompanied by the reopening of old wounds that time had only partially healed. "I have been thinking about forgiveness," he said quietly, acknowledging her presence without turning from his contemplation of the simple, wooden cross that adorned the altar. "My faith teaches that we must forgive those who wrong us. I confess I find it difficult to extend such mercy to those who would systematically destroy the cultural heritage of entire peoples." Miss Marple settled herself in one of the plain wooden pews that lined the chapel's modest nave. "Forgiveness, I have found, is often less about the person who has wronged us than about our own need for peace," she replied gently. "Though I have also observed that justice and mercy need not be considered mutually exclusive concepts." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the local vicar, who had come to conduct the evening service that had been temporarily suspended during the investigation. The Reverend Dr. Clement possessed the comfortable, scholarly bearing that Miss Marple had always associated with clergymen who combined genuine faith with intellectual rigor. "I trust the day's proceedings have gone satisfactorily," he inquired, his tone carrying the careful neutrality that characterized his approach to the more complex moral questions that arose in parish life. "As satisfactorily as such matters ever do," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess I've been struck by the curious way in which instruments of destruction can be transformed into agents of justice and restoration." The vicar's eyebrows rose with scholarly interest. "You're referring to the grandfather clock, I presume? I understand it has been restored to working order." Miss Marple nodded. "The village council has decided to place it in the War Memorial Hall, where its chimes will mark the hours in memory of those whose sacrifices were dishonored by theft. Rather fitting, I think." that something which was used as disguise murder should now serve to honor the memory of the fallen. As the simple evening service proceeded, with its familiar rhythms of prayer and reflection, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the peculiar alchemy by which human tragedy could be transformed into something approaching redemption. The grandfather clock that had crushed Reginald Blackwood would now sound the hours in tribute to men like Lieutenant Fletcher, whose medals had been stolen but whose memory would be preserved. The bronze centurion, too, would find a new purpose. Mr. Volkoff had announced his intention to donate it to the British Museum, where it would be displayed with full documentation of its role in bringing a criminal network to justice. Future visitors would learn not only of its artistic significance, but also of its curious history as an instrument of both crime and retribution. The investigation had revealed depths of human nature that range from the most despicable greed to the most noble sacrifice. Mr. Fletcher's fate would be determined by legal processes that would weigh his actions against both the law and the extraordinary circumstances that had driven him to violence. But the broader consequences of his desperate act would extend far beyond any individual judgment. As Miss Marple made her way home through the December darkness, the sound of the church bells marking the hour, she reflected upon the curious way in which human justice, for all its imperfections, occasionally achieved outcomes that seemed to satisfy both legal requirements and moral necessities. The stolen treasures would be returned, the victims would find a measure of peace, and future generations would inherit a cultural heritage that had been preserved through the most unlikely combination of circumstances. The grandfather clock at Thornfield Manor would continue to mark time, its steady rhythm a reminder that justice, like the passage of hours, moves with inexorable certainty toward its appointed destination, regardless of the human complications that may temporarily obscure its path.